Jon Arryn, the Warden of the Vale, and his role in what became Robert's Rebellion cannot be understated. When King Aerys II Targaryen demanded the heads of Lord Robert Baratheon and Lord Eddard Stark, Jon Arryn could very easily have handed the young men over to the Mad King, and with that the rebellion would have ended in a moment. In fact, it would never have been. His choice to protect his former wards, to call his banners to seek out justice for the murders of Lord Rickard Stark and young Brandon would cause a cascade of alliances built up over decades to call their banners alongside. The truth is, the events that prelude all this being possible happened decades ago, when Jon Arryn was still a young man. Jon was born as the eldest son of Lord Jasper Arryn. He had a younger brother, Ronald, and a sister, Alice. As his father's heir, Jon served as the keeper of the Gate of the Moon, and after his father's death and Jon's ascension as Lord of the Vale, he named his brother Ronald, and later his cousin Dennis, to that position. He had been married several times by this point, but none of these marriages, until now, had managed to produce a living heir. Jon's first wife was Jane Royce, who died in childbed, their daughter stillborn. His second marriage was to Rowena Arryn, a cousin, who died of a winter chill during a childless marriage. The widower status and lack of heir will later play a key part in what made the alliances supporting Robert's Rebellion so impactful. Much of this can actually be traced back to the War of the Nine Penny Kings, fought against Maelys Blackfire and the Band of Nine in 260 AC, when Jon had just about entered his 40s. He had fought for King Jaehaerys II Targaryen, along with most of the lords of Westeros. It was during this war on the Stepstones that Jon had become friends with Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell and Lord Steffon Baratheon of Storm's End, with this friendship later resulting in Jon taking their sons, Eddard and Robert, as his wards at the Eyrie in 271 AC. When Eddard was 8 years of age, Robert around a year older. The two boys grew extremely close, some say as close as blood brothers, even coming to see the childless Jon as a second father. It is also believed that around the same time, Jon had refused to foster the grandsons of Lord Walder Frey, Lord of the Twins, which some have put forward may have factored into the late addition of House Frey to Robert's banner towards the end of the rebellion. The War of the Nine Penny Kings, when looked back on in context of events that have now transpired, does indeed stand out as a war which brought the great lords of Westeros closer than ever before, with many lifelong friendships born in the bloodshed on the Stepstones. Importantly for this story, we know that Jon also had fought alongside Lord Hoster Tully of Riverrun. It is no coincidence that these four lords of Stark, Baratheon, Arryn and Tully forming this relationship would one day result in such unexpectedly strong and steadfast opposition to King Aerys II. While King Aerys II was certainly a paranoid man, there was little evidence to suggest there was any true plot involving these houses to overthrow the king prior to the kidnap of Lyanna Stark and the murders of Rickard and Brandon. But what Aerys failed to realise was these great houses didn't need to be plotting his downfall. Such was the close relationship between them. Calling for the heads of Eddard and Robert, of course, turned these close friends into firm allies. The first thing Jon Arryn had to do was ensure his wards got back to their seats in Storm's End and Winterfell, so they could call their own banners and rally their own men. This was even more vital in the case of Eddard, whose ascension to lordship was not just very sudden, but highly unexpected, given he was the second son of Lord Rickard. Thus it was vital for Eddard to return north and consolidate his position and rally his men for the long march south that was now surely to come. But as with anything with the history of Westeros, there was a complication. While Jon Arryn was widely respected among the Vale Lords, there was still a handful who ignored Jon's calling of his banners and instead remained loyal to the Iron Throne and King Aerys II, specifically House Grafton, the Lords of Goldtown, the Vale's largest town and only true port. Thus getting the young Lord of Winterfell north would not be an easy task. Thus the first mission for the rebels would be for Jon Arryn to consolidate the Vale and deal with the loyalists of Aerys II in Goldtown. Given the high walls around the town, this required a siege that would occupy the Loyalists as Eddard Stark was safely removed from the Vale. While Jon Arryn, his bannermen, and Robert Baratheon marched for Goldtown, Eddard crossed the Mountains of the Moon with a small escort to the Fingers, where a fisherman was hired to bring him across the bay north to White Harbour. But Eddard Stark's testing adventure is a tale for another time. The taking of Goldtown, while bloody, was not the largest or fiercest battle to fill the pages of history, but nonetheless important. The reality is the outcome was never actually in question. House Grafton had stayed loyal to King Aerys II, for what reasons we cannot say, but given Jon Arryn had the backing of most of the remaining Vale Lords, the taking of the town, in essence, was more of a formality. It is not clear when Robert Baratheon decided to press his own claim to the throne, but the fact he actively fought during the taking of Goldtown suggests that at this stage the idea of Robert becoming king was not one that had been discussed, given the danger Robert would have put himself in by taking part in the attack. But it must be said, during the taking of Goldtown, Robert Baratheon is said to have fought very well. He slew Mark Grafton with his now famed warhammer. With the port now taken, Robert was able to sail south to Storm's End to rally his own men as the rebellion, that was not yet called Robert's, grew. The taking of Goldtown by Jon Arryn allowed the defenders of the Vale to consolidate rebel control in the Vale of Arryn. Lyn Corbray famously won his knighthood fighting alongside House Grafton at the gates of Goldtown, but he joined Lord Arryn after the battle. The Vale was now firmly behind Jon Arryn. Eddard Stark was on his way north, Robert Baratheon south, but even so, it is said that the Mad King could still not see the threat these rebels posed, the cascading alliances forming against his rule. Yes, this rebellion came at the hands of Prince Rhaegar, but not in the way that Aerys had feared. His son lit the flame of war, and now the Mad King, despite his dislike for his heir, must defend him. Likewise, it was unclear what the goal of the rebels was at this time. The obvious answer would be the return of Lyanna Stark, and justice for the murder of Lord Rickard and Brandon, along with the other Northmen. But what would the end result of this look like? Robert would certainly want Rhaegar's life for the kidnap of his betrothed. Eddard Stark would of course want the return of his sister and to avenge the deaths of his family. Thus the Mad King Aerys could not be allowed to continue ruling. It creates a political black hole. Do they make the young Prince Viserys king and form a regency council like was done in the wake of the Dance of the Dragons? Or was this really the end of the House of the Dragon? Was the blood now tainted? At what point was it conveniently recalled that Robert Baratheon's own grandmother was a Targaryen? When did the idea of King Robert Baratheon first come to mind, and by whom? When did this rebellion in fact become Robert's? It would make sense at this juncture to take a moment to talk about Eddard Stark, as he would go on to play such a vital role in what became Robert's rebellion. Born in 263 AC, Eddard was the second son of Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell, the Warden of the North. The fact that Eddard was indeed a second son, history mostly neglects to document most of his early childhood, before his fostering with Jon Arryn in the Vale in 271 AC at the age of 8, and therein lies part of the issue for Eddard Stark, when he suddenly became Lord of Winterfell at his father and brother's murder by King Aerys II Targaryen. He was a second son, so his elder brother Brandon had been raised since childhood in the ways of rule and lordship. He sat at his father's side as any heir would, to ensure that when the time came, they were ready to take on the responsibilities of being lord. Being a second son, Eddard had very little of that same training, but given his success as a lord during the rebellion and the years since, it's very clear that Jon Arryn did enough to mould the young Eddard into a competent ruler. Even so, this rise to lordship was very sudden, not just because he was a second son, but given the fact that Rickard Stark was still a relatively young man who could have lived for decades more. Eddard's sudden rise was not just unexpected for Eddard himself, but the Kingdom of the North as a whole. While the North was mostly remained loyal to House Stark since they consolidated their power in the North during the Age of the First Men, given the uncertain political situation in the South and the idea of open rebellion, there was some fear Eddard may not have the full support of some of his more troublesome northern lords, which is exactly why Lord Eddard had to return to his seat in person to consolidate his own power and call his own banners, rather than remaining in the south and having one of his senior lords, or a younger brother, Benjen, do so on his behalf. As discussed prior, getting Eddard back to the north was more of a tricky matter than it might have first appeared, with Goldtown at the time under the control of House Grafton, who had sided with King Aerys II, and it being the only true port in the Vale meant that Eddard would have to find another way to gain safe passage back to Winterfell. With a small escort of guards, Eddard crossed the perilous Mountains of the Moon, hoping to find passage across the Bight in the Fingers. The mountains, even at the best of times in the height of summer, were a bleak and inhospitable place, with even some of the mountain tops still possessing snow caps. While of course there is a high road that passes through the mountains via the Bloody Gate and the Eyrie, the areas it passes are inhabited by the feared mountain clans, whom reject the authority of House Arryn, and have likewise been a thorn in the side of the Lords of the Vale for centuries, the likes of the Burned Men and the Painted Dogs, who would often target small and even larger groups of travellers along the high road, and of course, there was always the danger of falling into a rocky crevasse, hit by a falling boulder, or being eaten by a shadow cat. Thus, the journey for Eddard would be a perilous one. We cannot say for sure if Eddard and his guard took the high road, or if they took some sort of smaller mountain pass, but we know that he did reach the Fingers. The speed at which the journey was undertaken does suggest the latter. When he reached the Fingers after many days of hard travel, Eddard hired a local fisherman, promising him a bag of silver to take him across the Bight to White Harbour, the only true city in the north, and the seat of one of House Stark's most loyal bannermen, House Manderley. But the weather in the Bight is unpredictable at the best of times, and shortly after setting off, Eddard's small fishing boat was caught in a savage storm, the likes that had not been seen in a generation. The fisherman was lost at sea, drowned, but Eddard and the fisherman's daughter survived the ordeal and found safety and shelter on the Three Sisters, a small set of islands in the centre of the Bight where they would wait for calmer weather. This nameless fisherman's daughter would become the subject of much speculation and rumour in the years since the rebellion, with some in the north and further afield, especially in the Vale, speculating that this fisherman's daughter could have been the mother to Eddard Stark's bastard son. However, in truth, there is very little proof to support this suggestion, and it is likely an issue lost to the pages of time. But this fisherman's daughter will not be the only woman linked to the rumours of the bastard's parentage, with several more being suspected, some even highborn. Regardless, Eddard made his way to Sisterton, to the seat of House Borrell, while House Borrell was sworn to House Sunderland, who controlled the Three Sisters. In turn, House Sunderland were bannermen to House Arryn, and thus sworn to Jon Arryn. But, given the divisive nature of the rebellion, Eddard was unsure of the kind of reception he would receive. After all, some of Jon Arryn's bannermen on the mainland had remained loyal to King Aerys II. It is said that House Borrell's maester urged Lord Borrell to deliver Eddard's head to King Aerys II Targaryen. Not only would this prove his loyalty to the king, he too would likely be handsomely rewarded come the end of the rebellion. However, by this time, news of Goldtown's capture by Jon Arryn and Robert Baratheon had reached the sisters, and thus Jon Arryn's consolidation of his control of the Vale, giving Lord Borrell pause for thought. At this time, most lords would have been very unsure who would prevail in the conflict. Many had tried to overthrow the might of House Targaryen over the centuries. All had failed in a bloody end. Lord Borrell would hedge his bet somewhat. He allowed Eddard to leave for White Harbour without any hindrance, telling him to remain silent about his short stay in Sisterton in case the rebellion failed. Eddard Stark, known now for being a man of honour, seems to have kept Lord Borrell's request, with the tales of Eddard's brief stay at the Three Sisters only coming to light in the years after the rebels had won the war. Eddard was now free to sail to White Harbour. It is believed this mysterious fisherman's daughter remained behind, and as the unsubstantiated rumours claim, Eddard left her with a bag of silver and a bastard in her belly. Once Eddard reached the safety of White Harbour, he would take a boat up the White Knife River, then overland to Winterfell, where he could call his banners and prepare for war and the long, arduous journey south. Given the sheer size of the north, the gathering of men and resources takes much longer than the southern kingdoms. The Dance of the Dragons, and the many months it took Cregan Stark to gather and march his famous winter wolves south, is another keen example of this. Thus, in the weeks before Eddard could start south to join up with Robert Baratheon and Jon Arryn, fighting in earnest had already begun, and would only get bloodier when the savage Northmen entered the fray. After the taking of Goldtown, Robert Baratheon was now free to leave the Vale, to return to his seat at Storm's End, in the Stormlands to the south, to call his own banners and rally his men for the war to come. Sailing from Goldtown with a small escort, Robert's journey would be far less eventful than that of Eddard Stark, whose travels back to Winterfell we have already documented. But Robert's path was in theory far more dangerous than his good friend Eddard, with the Lord of Storm's End having to sail through the Bay of Crabs, then around the edge of Blackwater Bay itself, perilously close to the Targaryen seat of Dragonstone, where the royal fleet of King Aerys II Targaryen would certainly be patrolling in the event Robert attempted to make his way home to Storm's End. But return home to Storm's End he did, almost completely without hindrance. Once there, Robert assumed that his bannermen would come flocking to his call, and most did, but not all. Like in the Vale, there were a handful of lords who had remained loyal to King Aerys II Targaryen and to the Iron Throne. It is believed that House Grandison, Catherine, and Fell had been convinced by means unknown by the hand of the king, Lord Owen Merryweather, to oppose their lord's call for rebellion. So Robert could not think of marching his army north. He would, like Jon Arryn, have to consolidate his own power in the Stormlands first. Rallying your army takes time, and it would take time for Robert's loyal bannermen to reach Storm's End. And while the castle was near impregnable in a siege, for the moment at least, Robert Baratheon's position was weaker than he would have liked. But word reached him that houses Grandison, Catherine, and Fell were marching to Summerhall, the ruined palace of House Targaryen in the Dornish Marches, meeting there, then planning to march on Storm's End. And in that, the rash and hot-headed Lord Robert Baratheon saw an opportunity. A risky one, but if he could prevail, would ensure his control of the Stormlands in one fell swoop. Against advice, he would take the more unexpected path and march to Summerhall to meet them. Calling what happens next the Battle at Summerhall is a bit of a misnomer, as in reality what occurred there was 3 separate smaller battles. Robert Baratheon, with haste, with the loyal bannermen who had already reached Storm's End, marched on Summerhall, getting to the burned ruin before his adversaries. He would then write his name in legend, as he went on to fight 3 battles in the same day, defeating each of House Grandison, Catherine, and Fell as they arrived. And while Robert did lose men, it is believed the losses were minimal. Lords Grandison and Catherine survived the battle. Lord Fell was killed, with his son, known as Silver Axe Fell, captured. Robert returned to Storm's End with his captives, and after some time in the dungeons, all 3 men bent the knee to Robert and joined his cause against King Aerys II. It is believed that in the days after the battles at Summerhall, Robert spent much of his time hunting with the defeatist loyalist commanders while waiting for the rest of his bannermen to rally. His younger brother Stannis is said to have been angered by this and protested that Grandison, Catherine, and Fell would have happily handed Robert over to King Aerys for execution without a moment's hesitation if they had won at Summerhall, arguing his brother should have left them to rot in the dungeon as traitors, rather than treat them as you would an honoured guest. However, as is the running theme with Robert Baratheon, his brother's plea fell on deaf ears. The battles at Summerhall were a huge victory for Robert, whom for the most part at this stage in the war was an unknown and untested battle commander. His tactical outclassing of his foes caught the attention of many lords across Westeros, whom were maybe starting to see the young Stormlord as the real threat to House Targaryen for the first time. That is, if the Summerhall plan was in fact Robert's. While the strategy was credited to him, another of his bannermen, or perhaps a brother, could have been the true strategist of Summerhall. We will never know for sure, but as far as historical documentation goes, Robert Baratheon is the man credited. Before we move on, it seems prudent to take a moment now to talk about Robert Baratheon as a man. as this key context about his character goes some way in explaining his bold and rash decisions this hot-headed young lord would make over the course of the battles to come. Born in 262 AC, Robert was the firstborn child of Cassana Estamont and Steffon Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. He was just over a year older than his brother Stannis, who was born in 264 AC. When Robert was already in his teens, his younger brother, Renly, was born. As we have discussed, a friendship formed between Robert's father and Lord Jon Arryn during the War of the Nine Penny Kings. Robert would subsequently be fostered in the Vale by Jon Arryn, becoming fast friends with his foster brother, Eddard Stark. Robert still returned to Storm's End regularly, one time attending a tourney where he lost in a joust to Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard. Once he reached manhood, Robert spent less and less time at the Eyrie and more at Storm's End, given that he was the heir. It's been speculated by some that the death of his father and mother in 278 AC, while returning to the Stormlands after a mission in Essos for King Aerys II Targaryen, fueled Robert's hatred for House Targaryen and Aerys as far back as this time. With his father dead, Robert became Lord very suddenly at the age of 16. Some have attributed this young rise to lordship as a factor in Robert's temperamental personality and rashness. As we know, Robert was betrothed to Lyanna Stark when she was kidnapped by Rhaegar Targaryen, which added more fuel to the fire that was his dislike of House Targaryen. The truth is, for Robert at least, his betrothal to Lyanna was much more than that, and in reality, he had fallen deeply in love with Lyanna Stark. At the time of their betrothal, Robert already had a bastard daughter called Maya Stone in the Vale, which led to Lyanna commenting that Robert would never keep to one bed, despite his so-called love for her. Comments later made by Lord Eddard Stark would imply that Robert saw only Lyanna's beauty, and never truly recognised her boldness and strength of will, and thus they would never have truly have been happy. All this fits into what we know of Robert's personality. One thing that became very apparent is Robert was well loved by his soldiers, with often his skilled arms and bravery cited as why. But in truth, the young lord was headstrong, rash and impatient, something clearly shown with the battles at Summerhall. Yes, Robert won the day, but it was an extremely risky course of action that very easily could have ended up going the other way. But being a proud man, Robert would never have let the affront of his lords standing against him lay. Regardless, Robert Baratheon was truly fearless in battle, in a way only a green young man would be. But as he showed in the wake of Summerhall, he could be merciful and forgiving to even his foes and defeated enemies, with a keen ability to inspire loyalty and friendship in those he spared. While he did have a skill with a blade, even from youth, Robert preferred the unconventional, spiked iron warhammer, with Donal Noy, the blacksmith of Storm's End, making the famed one he used during the rebellion. Noy also made him a great antlered helmet that made him look like a horned god given his tall stature. Despite the numerous weapons in his armory, the only blade Robert ever used is a hunting knife he received as a boy from Jon Arryn. Given everything we have learned about Lord Robert Baratheon, it's not hard to understand why the charismatic young lord would become the centre of this rebellion, and why it became Robert's. After winning 3 battles in a single day at Summerhall, Robert Baratheon now had the time to rally his bannermen, with them gathering at Storm's End. With Jon Arryn marching from the Gate of the Moon in the Vale, Eddard Stark now returned to Winterfell, and beginning the long march south. It seemed obvious that Robert Baratheon, with his own lands now secure, would march north to the Riverlands to meet with his allies. But as to be expected in war, the loyalists of House Targaryen had other ideas, and hoped to prevent Robert from joining his forces with his supporters. Much like the days gone by of the Age of Heroes, the Lords of the Reach would prove to be an annoying thorn in the side of the young Stormlord. Lord Mace Tyrell had declared for King Aerys II Targaryen, and with him came all the power and riches of the Reach. The Reach's strength didn't just come from its ability to raise a large army, but the fact it was the breadbasket of Westeros, and one of the most financially prosperous of the Seven Kingdoms. Importantly for Lord Tyrell, he also had Lord Randall Tarly of Horn Hill as part of his army, a respected commander, a brave warrior, and in possession of one of the very few Valyrian steel blades left in Westeros, Heartsbane. While Robert had proven himself as a warrior at Goldtown and a commander at Summerhall, he was still very green and unexperienced, as well as very rash, something the Reachmen could perhaps exploit. Robert decided to act quickly now his western border of the Stormlands was no longer secure. With the Crownlands to the north, Dorne to the south, and the Reach to the west, the young lord found himself with enemies on all sides who could very easily box him in to the Stormlands. Thus Robert struck out from Storm's End with his army and headed west towards the Reach. He left behind his younger brother, the 18-year-old Stannis, with a small force to hold the castle to prevent the stronghold being taken in his absence. Stannis would fulfill his role dutifully and become one of the standout commanders of the rebellion. Crossing into the Reach, Robert managed to march as far as the town of Ashford, but it appears he was outmaneuvered by Lord Randyll Tarly, who was in command of the vanguard of Lord Tyrell's larger host, catching them just as the Stormlanders neared Ashford. The battle would be short and bloody, with both sides losing men. The biggest losses came from the Stormlanders. During the fight, Lord Tarly slew Lord Catherine with his Valyrian steel greatsword Heartsbane. After the battle, he is said to have cut off Catherine's head and sent it to Aerys as a gift. Before the Tyrell main host could join the vanguard at Ashford, Robert reluctantly withdrew from the Reach and marched north to his allies, leaving the Stormlands open for invasion and attack. Lord Mace Tyrell was publicly lauded and praised for the victory at Ashford, but the reality is, it was very much Randyll Tarly's day, as Mace only arrived at the battlefield well after the fighting was done. Rather than pursue Robert, Lord Tyrell chose to march into the Stormlands itself, to Storm's End, where he would lay siege to the castle for the rest of the rebellion. Shortly after the siege began, the Tyrell host was joined by Lord Paxter Redwine's mighty fleet from the Arbor, completing the siege by land and sea. It was only the steel and determination of Stannis Baratheon and his few men that prevented the fall of Storm's End. Due to the outcome of the rebellion, we tend to know much more about the roles of the rebels during the war than the Loyalists and House Targaryen. But something we do know for sure is that by the time of the Battle of Ashford, King Aerys II was getting increasingly frustrated with not only his son Prince Rhaegar, but also the Dornish, whom by right should be supporting the Loyalists, given Prince Rhaegar's wife, Elia Martell, was sister to the Prince of Dorne, Doran Martell, that her son, the babe Prince Aegon, would one day be king. It is said that even before the rebellion, that Doran Martell was furious at the humiliation and mistreatment his sister had suffered at the hands of King Aerys II, and thus this has been credited to his slow movement and preparations for war. Elia and her children typically resided on Rhaegar's seat of Dragonstone. Not only would it be safer in the event of King's Landing falling, but it kept her away from Aerys and the volatile situation within his court. But with Rhaegar rallying the Targaryen forces, Aerys commanded Elia and her children to return to the Red Keep, which she reluctantly did. As the threat of the rebels increasingly grew, it is said that Aerys directly threatened Elia's uncle, Lewin Martell, who was a member of his own Kingsguard, reminding him that Elia, Rhaenys and Aegon were under his care. Soon after this, Lewin returned to Dorne and took command of 10,000 Dornishmen, who would march through the Red Mountains north and aid Prince Rhaegar. While we cannot know for sure the exact timing of these events, it is believed to have happened after the Battle of Ashford, but before 283 AC. But King Aerys II Targaryen was not done there. He was now moved to action, seeing the rebels as a true threat to House Targaryen that they were. Owen Merryweather had been serving as Hand of the King since the departure of Tywin Lannister in 281 AC. In Aerys' eyes at least, Owen proved ineffectual in preventing the uprising. While he did attempt to win the favour of some of the Stormlords, it was not enough to stop Robert Baratheon from building his army. These failures and perceived inactions made the paranoid Aerys believe that Lord Merryweather was conspiring with them and was in fact a rebel. Owen was subsequently stripped of his lands and titles and exiled for his failures. In truth, given the nature of the Mad King, it is lucky that Owen managed to leave King's Landing with only an exile, given the fiery fates most who fell the Mad King received. Aerys was now in need of a new hand, and the king, being his erratic self, took a path few could have foreseen. To match the youth of Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark, two were the key leaders of the rebellion. Aerys wanted someone younger and vigorous as his next hand, so he named Jon Connington to the office. Tywin Lannister had always considered Connington to be too young and impetuous, with some speculation Tywin's dislike of Connington being the true motivation for Aerys' appointment. Connington was a very left-field choice as hand, to say the least, a choice that took many by surprise, given his age and position. Jon was the only son of Armon Connington, the Lord of Griffin's Roost, and his wife. He served as a squire in King's Landing, first alongside Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, and later for the Crown Prince himself. Jon was considered to be one of Prince Rhaegar's dearest friends. Some felt Jon was the most headstrong of the young lordlings who gathered around Rhaegar, seeking his favour. However, the nature of Jon's friendship with Rhaegar is debated, with some sources claiming it was very one-sided on Connington's part. During a time when Jon's father was still alive, Rhaegar was returning from a trip to Dorne and visited Griffin's Roost for a fortnight. At the welcoming feast, Rhaegar played a song on his harp that made every woman in the hall cry, but per Jon's recollection, none of the men. Rhaegar later visited the tallest tower of the castle with Jon and complimented the beauty of Connington lands. After Armon died, Jon inherited the rule of Griffin's Roost. When Jon left to serve at King's Landing, he would name his cousin Sir Ronald Connington as Castellan. In 280 AC, Jon would be present at the wedding of Rhaegar to Princess Elia Martell of Dorne, and a year later, in 281, he was also present at the tourney at Harrenhal, where he is said to be one of the men who danced with a Shara Dane. Jon's apparent friendship with Rhaegar also struck many as odd, given Aerys' appointment, specifically because of the distrust between Aerys and Rhaegar, with weeks ago, Aerys fearing his son would try and depose him. Regardless, this new hand would not make the same mistakes. He would take action, and take the fight directly to the rebels. The whole town was a nest of traitors. At the end, they had hidden the usurper in a brothel. What sort of king was that? Who would hide behind the skirts of women? Yet, whilst the search dragged on, Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully came down upon the town with a rebel army. Bells and battle followed, and Robert emerged from his brothel with a blade in hand, and almost slew Jon on the steps of the old sept that gave the town its name. The Thoughts of Jon Connington, A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 61, The Griffin Reborn. While Robert Baratheon was already winning and losing battles in the Stormlands and the Reach, Eddard Stark had managed to reach Winterfell after a long and perilous journey where he called his banners. Given the sheer size and low population density of the north, it would take several weeks for Lord Eddard Stark's bannermen to rally, with some closer to the neck, waiting to meet him on the march. Over the next few weeks, the Northmen marched south, through the neck, where they were joined by the Crannog men of House Reed, before finally reaching the Riverlands. Jon Arryn, too, had now gathered his full strength after securing Goldtown, setting out from the Gate of the Moon to join up with Eddard, his former ward. Together, they negotiated with Lord Hoster Tully, the Lord of Riverrun, for his support. Given the already close relationship between the houses, and Lord Tully's eldest daughter betrothed to Eddard's brother before he was killed by the Mad King, it made for an easy alliance. Thus, things were looking bleak for Aerys II and House Targaryen, as now they faced the full might of the North, the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands. With the Westerlands and Iron Islands yet to declare for either side, the numbers were starting to favour the rebels greatly, should they be able to form a single, huge army. Lord Jon Connington, the new hand of the king, would be much more proactive than his predecessor, Owen Merryweather, and he decided the best way to deal with the rebels was to face them in the field before they could create this single, unified army. He would lead a mighty army, mostly made up of men of the Crown Lands, into the field, heading out from King's Landing towards the border of the Riverlands and the Reach, hoping to catch Robert before he could rally with his fellow rebels. As they set out, the army of Robert Baratheon was heading north, hoping to rally with the other rebel lords. The march from the Stormlands had been hard, with Robert's men taking losses at the Battle of Ashford, being run out of the Reach and Stormlands by the forces of Mace Tyrell, led by Randyll Tarly. Connington gave chase once they left King's Landing, and Robert's men, already tired, now faced an even more grueling march, with fresh men now on their tail. While recorded history does not tell us how, Robert Baratheon was wounded through unknown means. He eventually took refuge at Stony Sept, a large town south of Acorn Hall and west of the God's Eye, just inside the Riverlands. This town would become the site of one of the most important battles in the rebellion, becoming known in the pages of history as the Battle of the Bells. Not being too far behind Robert's army, Jon Connington took the town by force, knowing that Robert Baratheon hid somewhere within its walls. For reasons that are not wholly clear to us, the residents of Stony Sept were actively trying to help Robert, even though Connington and his men could easily put them all to death for conspiring with a traitor to the crown. A long and drawn-out search ensued, with Connington's men conducting a door-to-door sweep of the entire town several times over. Robert Baratheon could still not be found. Using his power as Hand of the King, he offered the townsfolk pardons for hiding the Stormlord or for any information regarding his whereabouts. But still, no man or woman came forward. He then offered huge rewards for information, but still, no one entertained this idea. Finally, the Hand resorted to threats. Connington took several hostages from among the townsfolk and placed them in crow cages hung around the town square, but still, not a single member of the townfolk of Stony Sept stepped forward to offer information. Despite all his efforts, Robert Baratheon could not be found, despite the fact Connington knew he was somewhere close and in reach. The townsfolk had kept Robert moving from location to location within the town as Connington's men were conducting their searches, meaning they could look in the same place twice and still not find the Stormlord. Thanks to accounts of the men who were at Stony Sept, we know that the last of these hiding places was an inn and a brothel called the Peach, located on the eastern side of the town in its main market square. It is believed that one of the whores who was working at the Peach became a favourite of Robert whilst he hid within the inn, with him supposedly fathering a bastard daughter on her named Bella. Battle began very suddenly when Lord Eddard Stark and Lord Hoster Tully arrived with a rebel army intent on rescuing Robert. Somehow, word must have reached the rebel lords that Robert was alive and well inside of the town and was in need of rescue. The rebels charged into the town from multiple directions. Soldiers from both sides fought in the streets and alleys, and even on the rooftops. As the streets turned red with blood, the Septons inside the Sept rang the bells to warn the residents to lock their doors and stay inside. What would become known as the Battle of the Bells was fierce and the most brutal battle of the war thus far, with it sometimes appearing more like a huge street brawl. When the leaders of the armies came face to face, Jon Connington did manage to wound Lord Hoster Tully and kill Jon Arryn's cousin and heir, Sir Denys Arryn. At the sound of the bells, Robert Baratheon emerged from the Peach with a sword in hand. Robert is said to have slain 6 men that day in a bloody rage, including Prince Rhaegar's friend and former squire, Sir Miles Mouton. Some accounts of the battle say that Robert Baratheon and Jon Connington did not meet on the battlefield, while some others suggest that Jon was nearly slain by Robert on the steps of the town's Sept. Regardless, Jon realised the battle was lost and retreated back to King's Landing. Robert, in the wake of the battle, and even years later maintained that Eddard Stark won that battle for him, and without Eddard, it was only a matter of time until Connington eventually found Robert. Suspicious of the loss at Stony Sept, King Aerys II Targaryen exiled Jon Connington, stripping him of his titles. Aerys now had begun to realise that Robert Baratheon was the greatest threat to his dynasty since Daemon I Blackfyre, and he named Lord Carlton Chestald as Hand in Connington's stead and tasked him to deal with Robert. Sir Jonathan Darry and Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard were sent to rally what was left of Connington's men, while their Lord Commander Sir Gerald Hightower was sent by King Aerys to try and find the missing Prince Rhaegar. The Crown Prince did eventually return from the south and convinced his father to ask Tywin Lannister for help. It was also around this time that Aerys commanded his alchemists to place caches of wildfire in multiple locations around King's Landing, which he could ignite in the event that King's Landing fell to the rebels. In his youth, Ned had fostered at the Eyrie, and the childless Lord Arryn had become a second father to him, and his fellow ward Robert Baratheon, when the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen had demanded their heads. The Lord of the Eyrie had raised his Moon and Falcon banner in revolt, rather than give up those he had pledged to protect. One day, 15 years ago, this second father had become a brother as well, as he and Ned stood together in the Scepter River Run to wed two sisters, the daughters of Lord Hoster Tully. The thoughts of Catelyn Stark, A Game of Thrones Chapter 2, Catelyn 1. After the Battle of the Bells in early 283 AC, the victorious rebels rallied in the Riverlands, while King Aerys II sent the Kingsguard to gather the remaining loyalist forces, as well as find the missing Prince Rhaegar. Thus, for a short while at least, there was a few weeks of relative calm. Behind closed doors, however, politics was still being played, and alliances strengthened. We must now take a moment to recall that prior to the outbreak of the rebellion, Eddard Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, betrothed his eldest son and heir Brandon to Catelyn Tully, the eldest daughter of Lord Hoster Tully, Lord of Riverrun. Brandon was travelling to Riverrun in preparation for this very wedding when the news of Lyanna Stark's kidnap reached him, and he rushed to his horrific fate in King's Landing. Prior to all of this, Brandon had spent some time at Riverrun getting to know his new bride. During this time, Peter Baelish, Hoster Tully's low-born ward and future Master of Coin to King Robert Baratheon after the war, challenged Brandon over Catelyn's hand. Stark easily defeated Peter, leaving him bloody and scarred in the ensuing duel at Riverrun. There are some tales that suggest that while recovering from his wounds, Peter slept with Catelyn's younger sister, Lysa, and impregnated her. Enraged by this, Lord Tully sent Peter back to the Fingers to complete his healing, keeping him away from both his daughters for the foreseeable future. Other sources also state that this supposed affair between Peter and Lysa resulted in a pregnancy, with Lysa forced to end it by her father with the use of moon tea. The wedding of Brandon and Catelyn was supposed to take place in 282, if not for the abduction of Lyanna Stark. Brandon had promised Catelyn that he would return to Riverrun from confronting Prince Rhaegar in King's Landing, and that they would then marry. But, as we well know by this point, Rhaegar Targaryen was not in the capital, and his father, King Aerys II, had Brandon and his companions imprisoned for treason. He summoned their fathers to court, and the Mad King then had father and son executed in the throne room of the Red Keep. Aerys had Rickard burned to death, while Brandon strangled himself, trying to save his father nearby. King Aerys next called for the heads of Robert Baratheon and Rickard's second son, Eddard Stark, who had grown up in the Vale of Arryn as wards of Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie. Jon's refusal to surrender his former wards began Robert's rebellion and led us directly to 283 AC, where Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully had successfully rescued Robert Baratheon from loyalist forces in the Battle of the Bells. As part of gaining the support for the rebels of House Tully, Eddard had agreed to marry Catelyn in his late brother Brandon's place, thus reforming the alliance between House Stark and Tully in a much more secure and permanent fashion. The widowed and heirless Jon Arryn, meanwhile, had been left in a tricky political situation after his heirs had both been killed during the rebellion, his nephew Elbert and his cousin Sir Dennis. Jon was already an old man by this point, aged 65 years of age, even older than Hoster Tully. He agreed to marry Hoster's youngest daughter, Lysa, to create a strong and close kinship between the three great houses of Stark, Arryn and Tully, with the goal of adding House Baratheon to that number if and when Robert Baratheon married Lyanna Stark. This would create an alliance of the likes had not been seen for generations during the Targaryen era of Westeros, and solidify the threat to King Aerys II's rule the rebels were becoming. While it might not seem like it from a Tully point of view, the match between Lysa and Jon was extremely beneficial, given how public the rumours of Peter and Lysa's affair had become. For the childless Jon Arryn, Lysa's now proven fertility did improve the possibility of him fathering his own heir, and prevent a succession crisis in the Vale, as it was not clear who the next in line to become Lord of the Eyrie was. Witnesses to the event say that Lysa Tully wept greatly the morning of the double wedding, and was near inconsolable by anyone. The weddings themselves were to be held in the modest sept at Riverrun, with it known that at least Lord Hoster Tully, Sir Brendan Tully, Lord Jason Mallister, Sir Desmond Grell, Lord William Dustin, Jory Cassell, and Lord Robert Baratheon would be there to lay witness. By the time that it came to the actual wedding ceremony, Lysa was dry-eyed and radiant, almost happy. Jon Arryn draped his cream and blue cloak over her shoulders, and Lysa Tully became Lysa Arryn. The same Andal custom was followed for the marriage of Eddard Stark and Catelyn Tully, despite how Stark and Eddard in particular being devoted followers of the old gods. Jason Mallister, Lord of Seaguard, brought lavish gifts to the wedding, and he jested with Sir Brendan Tully, Hoster's brother, during the wedding feast. Sir Brendan the Blackfish, who had often quarrelled with his elder brother in terms of his own proposed marriages, informed Hoster that after the feast he would be departing Riverrun to serve his niece Lysa and Lord Arryn in the Vale, with Jon making him the knight at the gate. When it came time for the bedding ceremony, Jory Cassel is said to have torn Catelyn's wedding gown, and Sir Desmond Grau later had to apologise repeatedly for making bawdy jokes. Eddard would stay at Riverrun for a fortnight, during which Catelyn would become pregnant with their first child, Robb Stark. Eddard would not meet his son for many months until the war had come to an end. Catelyn and Lysa would remain at Riverrun with a small garrison, while their father, Lord Hoster, and their new husbands, Eddard Stark and Jon Arryn, left to carry on the rebellion against House Targaryen. Lysa too had hoped she had become pregnant with Jon's child as well, but time would prove this would not be the case. The importance of these marriages and the way they tied the great houses of Westeros together cannot be understated. It almost ensured there would be no peaceful resolution possible for the rebellion, with the full might of the North, Stormlands, Riverlands, and Vale now bound together in an unbreakable way, with the single goal of bringing the reign of the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen to an end, and now even destroy the House of the Dragon itself. King Aerys II had always been paranoid his son and lords were plotting to depose him from power for years, with that paranoia only serving to push him deeper into madness. In a way, it was this fear of his own son and lords itself that inadvertently set the stage for the rebellion. His paranoia brought the great lords of Westeros together as one. I thought the man craven, but the day he confronted Aerys, he found some courage somewhere. He did all he could to dissuade him. He reasoned, he jested, he threatened, and he finally begged. When all that failed, he took off his chain of office and flung it down on the floor. Aerys burnt him alive for that, and hung the chain on the neck of Rosard, his favourite pyromancer. Jaime Lannister to Brienne of Tarth, A Storm of Swords, Chapter 37, Jaime 5. The timeline of events towards the last few weeks and months of Robert's rebellion, especially in terms of the Loyalists and House Targaryen, is a little vague due to most surviving sources coming from the rebels. What we can say is this: that after the Battle of the Bells and the resulting exile of the Hand of the King, Jon Connington, King Aerys II Targaryen would start to take the threat of the rebels a lot more seriously than he had done up until this point. He did 3 key things during the next few weeks. Firstly, he named Lord Carlton Chelstead as the new Hand of the King to replace the short-lived Connington in the role. Carlton has served as Master of Coin for much of Aerys' later reign, and after the sacking of Owen Merryweather as Hand, found himself as one of the very few members of the Small Council left. Thus, with the sacking of Connington as Hand, Carlton was one of the very few men Aerys had left to choose from. Despite that, however, many who remember Carlton suggest that under a different king, in a different time, he probably had the ability to make a respectable Hand of the King. Secondly, the Battle of the Bells was a huge loss for the Loyalists, not just missing the opportunity to kill Robert Baratheon, but the sheer loss of men at the battle itself. At this time, the Targaryen army was nothing to laugh at, but of the houses that had declared for Aerys, they were miles away, spread across the realm, while the rebels were converging and forming one huge army. Mace Tyrell had the strength of the Reach, but he was sieging Storm's End, and the Dornish had yet to leave the Red Mountains, with Aerys sending Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard to ensure the Dornish marched soon, using Princess Elia Martell as a veiled threat towards Prince Doran in Sunspear. This meant, for the time being at least, Aerys and the Targaryen forces of the Crownlands were on their own, with no sign of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the very man who had started this war. Thus, Aerys sent Sir Barristan Selmy and Sir Jonathan Darry of the Kingsguard back to Stony Sept to rally what remained of John Connington's broken army. Finally, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Gerald Hightower, was sent south to locate Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and return him back to King's Landing with or without the kidnapped Lyanna Stark. Sir Gerald did locate Rhaegar in the Red Mountains of Dorne near the Prince's Pass, at a place Rhaegar had called the Tower of Joy, as the prince did indeed return to the city. But oddly, Sir Gerald remained at the Tower of Joy. Sir Oswell Went and Sir Arthur Dane of the Kingsguard, who had been with Rhaegar at the Tower of Joy, also stayed behind. It is speculated it was to guard Lyanna Stark. Why she needed 3 members of the Kingsguard, including the Lord Commander, to protect her is something we will never know the truth of. But, and for many is one of the biggest mysteries of Robert's Rebellion, it is assumed that Rhaegar himself gave the order. You are not old enough to have known Aerys Targaryen. Aerys was mad and cruel. No one has ever denied that. But he was still king, crowned and anointed. You had sworn to protect him. I know what I swore. Jaime Lannister and Brienne Tarth. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 11, Jaime 2. Knowing that his position was a weak one, King Aerys II Targaryen's erratic madness only deepened. Fearing that the rebels could now march on King's Landing near on unopposed, King Aerys ordered the Alchemists' Guild and his pyromancers, with their leader, Wisdom Rosard, to increase its production of wildfire and place huge caches of the liquid around the city of King's Landing. It was Aerys' intent that should the city fall to the rebels, that the wildfire be lit, and the city and the Red Keep burned to nothing but ash. If he could not hold the city, then no one would have it. Upon discovering this plot, Lord Carlton Chelstead, the Hand of the King, confronted Aerys, and when he realised the king could not be dissuaded from this path, he resigned his position of hand in disgust on the spot, taking off his chain of office and throwing it at the king's feet. Aerys had him burned alive for this, but Carlton kept his honour and is remembered as the last voice of reason within the Red Keep. The Alchemists' Guild had enjoyed royal favour ever since the Defiance of Duskendale, owing to the king's obsession with wildfire. So Aerys appointed the head of the guild, Wisdom Rosard, as his final hand, a man who would indulge the worst of King Aerys Targaryen. It's very easy during this complex timeline to forget some of the other key figures who were a part of it. When Aerys gave a man to the flames, Queen Rhaella would have a visitor in the night. Jaime Lannister's Thoughts, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 16, Jaime 2. In the later years of the marriage of King Aerys and Queen Rhaella, the Mad King's insanity set in deeply. While the relationship had always been cold and unwanted, it only became more strained as Aerys became more mentally broken after the Defiance of Duskendale. According to Sir Barristan Selmy, Rhaella did her best to protect the young Prince Viserys Targaryen from the worst of his father's excesses, keeping her child oblivious to the fact Aerys was slipping deeper into madness. According to Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard, who is often the Kingsguard Knight assigned to protect Rhaella and Viserys, Rhaella's eyes had been closed for years by that time. By the time that Aerys had ordered the wildfire placed all over King's Landing, it had become widely known in the years since the rebellion that Aerys grew sexually abusive towards Rhaella, developing a fetish for fire and death, and only sleeping with his wife after he had executed someone by burning. The last time this was done was during the rebellion, and after Aerys had burned Lord Carlton Chelstead. Again, the statements of Jaime Lannister recall listening outside Rhaella's bedchamber as she cried as the king abused her. When Jaime protested that the Kingsguard was sworn to defend the queen as well, his sworn brother, Sir Jon Darry, replied, "We are, but not from him." The queen's maids reported seeing scratches, bruises and bite marks all over her body. It is believed it was this event witnessed by Jaime Lannister after the burning of Lord Carlton that resulted in the conception of Princess Daenerys. But it was now time for the final attempt of House Targaryen to beat the rebels in the field. With Prince Rhaegar now back in King's Landing, he would lead the Loyalist army to face the rebels in a battle that would change the fate of Westeros forever, the Battle of the Trident. The battle was a bloody thing. The singers would have us believe it was all Rhaegar and Robert struggling in the stream for a woman both of them claimed to love. but I assure you, other men were fighting too. The elder brother to Brienne of Tarth, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 31, Brienne 6. When you look back at the history of Westeros, not just during the Targaryen era, but most wars, even ones fought over years gone by, usually come down to one single large-scale pitched battle between the full strength of both sides of the conflict. The Battle of the Red Grass Field is the perfect example of this. The Blackfyre Rebellion up until this point had been fairly open going into the Red Grass Field. Whoever won the day would win the war. Thus why the Battle of the Trident has become synonymous with Robert's Rebellion, being the death knell for the Loyalists and the Mad King. But more than that, the end of a dynasty that had ruled 7 kingdoms of Westeros for 283 years. The end of the blood of the dragon. For most of the war, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had effectively been missing, with the kidnapped Lyanna Stark. But after King Aerys had sent members of the Kingsguard to locate his son, he had returned from his hiding place in Dorne, and was now ready to enter the fray and lead the rallied loyalist forces. King Aerys himself, as expected, remained behind in the Red Keep, with Princess Elia Martell and Prince Rhaegar's children. Elia's uncle, Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard, assumed command of 10,000 Dornishmen who marched up the King's Road and joined them to Rhaegar's royalist army en route to the Trident. At the same time, Sir Barristan Selmy and Sir Jonathan Darry of the Kingsguard were sent to rally the scattered forces of the former hand Lord John Connington. Additionally, Rhaegar persuaded his father to ask for help from his old hand of the king, Lord Tywin Lannister. However, Tywin had not yet responded to this call. In total, Rhaegar was marching with over 40,000 men, slightly more than the rebel forces. It would have been considerably more if Rhaegar had been joined by the forces of the Reach, but Mace Tyrell and the Red Wine Fleet were stuck in the Stormlands, besieging Storm's End. The rebel army had managed to rally into a single large force with minimal losses in the process. The Northmen were under the command of Lord Eddard Stark, with men from House Bolton, Karstark, Manderley, Mormont and Umber making up a large proportion of the army. Forces of the Vale under the command of Lord Jon Arryn, with most of the houses in the Vale joining with their lord, with the exception of House Grafton, who remained loyal to the Iron Throne and were defeated in the Battle of Goldtown. Things were not so clear when it came to the Riverlords under the command of Lord Hoster Tully, with the Riverlords themselves deeply divided during the war. Houses such as Darry, Goodbrook, Mooton and Rhaegar, some with personal ties to House Targaryen, taking up the royal cause. House Frey the twins, the largest house sworn to House Tully, were slow to gather their levies, but were backing the rebels. Lord Hoster still had command of most of the Riverland houses, while Robert Baratheon had managed to march a large portion of his Stormlords to the Trident. Many houses from the southern Stormlands had been trapped in the south by the Reach army at Storm's End. Thus, while Robert Baratheon did contribute to the number of rebels, it was not so much as the other rebel lords. It should fairly be noted that the young Lord of Storm's End had already seen the most action during this war. Do you remember the Trident, Your Grace? I won my crown there. How should I forget it? Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, A Game of Thrones, Chapter 12, Eddard 2. The Trident itself is known as the lifeblood of Westeros, and over the course of history, many battles have been fought along its banks. Once again, blood would be spilled near and in its waters. The battle itself would take place near a crossing north of Harrenhal, between Lord Harroway's town and Saltpans. The crossing will be marked forever in the annals of history as the Ruby Ford, for reasons that will soon become clear. The rebels held the north bank of the river, needing to cross south. The loyalists, and Rhaegar Targaryen, in his stunning black enamel and ruby dragon head plate armour, held the south bank. It would be Rhaegar who made the first move, marching into the ford towards his foe. As he did, Robert Baratheon let out a booming command, and with that, fighting began. The Dornishmen, under the command of Lewin Martell, are said to have fought valiantly and threatened Robert's left flank severely. Sir Lyn Corbray of the rebels, picking up his wounded father's Valyrian steel sword Lady Forlorn, led a mad heroic charge and broke the Dornishmen's line. During the charge, Lyn killed an already injured Lewin, and the Dornish broke. On the other side of the battle, Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard killed several men single-handedly, and Lord Jason Mallister of the rebels slew 3 of Rhaegar's most loyal bannermen. The battle was long, The battle was bloody, and in situations such as this, no one really wins. Many great lords and knights, men young and old, either lost their lives or made names of themselves in the fighting. But in the end, the battle was decided when Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen met in a legendary single combat on horseback in the stream itself that would change the fate of Westeros forever. Accounts of exactly what happened in the ford differ. Some say the duel was only moments, but some others that it went on for a long while. But Robert eventually raised his huge warhammer and crushed Rhaegar Targaryen's chest with a blow so strong it caved in the prince's breastplate. The rubies adorning Rhaegar's armor were shattered free to litter the river, giving the ruby ford its name. Rhaegar Targaryen, the Prince of Dragonstone, the man who had once shown so much promise to become a great king, died broken and bloody in the waters of the Trident. And with him, the last hope of House Targaryen, now leaderless and hopeless, the royal army broke and fled, some back to King's Landing, some back to their homes. The battle screamed about Lord Robert and Prince Rhaegar both, and by the will of the gods or by chance, or perhaps by design, they met amidst the shallows of the ford. The two knights fought valiantly upon their desaries, according to all accounts, for despite his crimes, Prince Rhaegar was no coward. The writings of Yandel, The World of Ice and Fire, The Fall of the Dragons, Robert's Rebellion. In the direct aftermath, Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard was close to death when he was brought before Robert Baratheon. Although he was counselled to kill him by Lord Roose Bolton, Robert spared Barristan's life and sent his own maester to tend to his wounds. Lord Wyman Manderley granted the Wolf's Den to Sir Bartimus as reward for saving his life during the battle. Both sons of Morse Crowsfoot Umber were killed at the Trident, and Lord Grandison died a year later from wounds sustained in the fighting. The son of Lord Goodbrook made peace with Lord Hoster Tully and Robert. The battle was the decisive engagement of the war. Walder Frey arrived after the battle was over, so Lord Hoster Tully has since called him the late Lord Frey and questioned his loyalty. When King's Landing learned of Prince Rhaegar's defeat, King Aerys II sent the pregnant Queen Rhaella with Prince Viserys to Dragonstone for their own safety, as Prince Viserys was now his heir and the only hope for House Targaryen. Aerys kept Elia Martell and her children by Rhaegar at the Red Keep as a threat against Doran Martell, Prince of Dorne, since the Mad King thought he was betrayed by Prince Lewin at the Trident. Where he got this notion from we cannot say, but some speculate it was the whispers of one of the few remaining members of the small council. The way to King's Landing was now open for the rebels, while the only significant loyalist forces left were invested in the siege of Storm's End, but there was not enough of them to face the combined forces of the rebels. But there was one thing that did give the rebels a pause for thought. Tywin Lannister had entered the war. They learned that Lord Tywin was heading towards King's Landing, and it seemed most likely to aid Aerys. Lord Robert Baratheon had been wounded during the battle, so it was left to Lord Eddard Stark to lead the rebel vanguard down the King's Road towards the capital, racing to reach it before the Lannisters. I expected to find the gates closed to us. Instead, you found that our men had already taken the city. What of it? Not our men. The line of the Lannisters flew over the ramparts, not the crowned stag. They had taken the city by treachery. Treachery was a coin the Targaryens knew well. Lannister paid them back in kind. It was no less than they deserved. I shall not trouble my sleep over it. You were not there. There was no honour in that conquest. Eddard Stark and King Robert Baratheon. Game of Thrones Chapter 12. Eddard II. The Battle of the Trident, in effect, was the killing blow for House Targaryen during Robert's rebellion. With the smashing of the Loyalist army and the death of Prince Rhaegar at the Ruby Ford, the path was now clear for the rebels to march directly on King's Landing. While the men of the Reach, under the leadership of Mace Tyrell, had not taken part in the Trident as they were besieging Storm's End, at this point in time they were too few and too far away to put down the rebels. As Robert Baratheon had picked up a minor wound during the battle, it was left to the young Lord of Winterfell, Eddard Stark, to lead the vanguard of the rebel host on the march to King's Landing. There was only one thing that could prove a challenge for Eddard and the rebels. It seemed at last that Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, had finally made a move, and many feared he had listened to the pleas of his former friend, King Aerys II Targaryen, and would now march on King's Landing to stop the rebels. While the total Lannister host was smaller than the combined rebel army, they were fresh, and under the command of Lord Tywin, arguably the best battle commander of his generation. If he was indeed coming to the aid of King Aerys, despite his forces' small number, he would still be a real threat to the rebels, and could become a banner for the shattered loyalists to rally to. Lord Tywin sent no word of what his intent was to Aerys or the rebels. Thus, Lord Eddard began the march, not knowing if he would be facing a friend or a foe. It must also be recalled that when word of the Trident had reached Aerys, he had already been preparing for defeat, having placed caches of wildfire around King's Landing. In the Mad King's mind, if he could not hold the city, then no one could have it. He would burn it to ash in one last show of the power of House Targaryen. Queen Rhaegar, now heavily pregnant, and Prince Viserys had already been moved to Dragonstone for their own safety. Some have put forward that in this act of martyrdom by Aerys, he hoped to kill enough of the rebel commanders that his remaining loyal lords would then rally behind Prince Viserys and crush the rebels in their disorganized panic. But who can truly know the mind of the Mad King and his intentions? Fearing the Dornish had betrayed him at the Trident, Aerys had also moved Princess Elia Martell and Rhaegar's young children, Rhaenys and Aegon, to the Red Keep, perhaps using them as shields from what he saw as Dornish betrayal. All I did was for House Lannister, always, for years. Your Lord Father, ask him, I was ever his true servant. 'Twas I who bid Aerys to open his gates. So, the sack of King's Landing was your work as well. For the realm, once Rhaegar died, the war was done. Grand Maester Pycelle and Tyrion Lannister, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 25. Tyrion 6. 2 weeks had passed since the Trident and the death of Prince Rhaegar, when dust blew into the sky and the hills beyond King's Landing as an army approached this tinderbox of a city. No one knew if they were friend or foe. In the distance, the scarlet and gold lion banner of House Lannister came into sight. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, had beaten Eddard Stark and the rebels to the capital. He appeared at the gate of King's Landing with a force of 12,000 men from the Westerlands, more than enough to be able to hold and defend the city in the event of an assault by the rebels. It seemed to many that despite the animosity between Aerys and Tywin, Tywin had been the answer to his old friend's prayers. Many assumed Tywin's loyalty was with Aerys and requested entrance into the city, but perhaps seeing the situation for what it truly was, Lord Varys, the Spider, the master of whisperers, told the king to keep the gates closed or face his doom. It was Grand Maester Pycelle who convinced the king to open the gates to Tywin. Given the close working relationship between the Grand Maester and Lord Tywin, the idea Pycelle would be involved in Tywin's plot is not a surprise. Aerys ordered the gates open, and in an instant the Lannister forces began to sack the city, killing people of all ages and abusing women and children alike. A hand-picked group of men by Tywin raced to the Red Keep on horseback to storm the walls, while the defenders were still disorganized. Tywin Lannister had chosen his side, and it was not that of the king. All hope for Aerys was now truly lost. I saw King's Landing after the sack. Babes were butchered that day as well, and old men, and children at play. More women were raped than you can count. Draw a moment to Daenerys Targaryen, A Storm of Swords, Chapter 23. Daenerys 2. Inside the walls of the Red Keep, Tywin Lannister's eldest son, Sir Jaime Lannister the Kingsguard, was one of the few White Cloaks still in the city after the Battle of the Trident, and thus had the duty of protecting the king. Knowing that King's Landing would fall to his father, now the gates had been opened, Jaime pleaded with the Mad King to allow him to treat with Tywin for a peaceful outcome, but instead, Aerys ordered Jaime to kill his own father instead. When a man joins the White Cloaks, they forego any alliance to their own house and kin. But even so, this surely puts Sir Jaime in a testing position, pushing any man to his limits. With the Lannister forces sacking the city, Aerys held an audience with his new hand of the king, Wisdom Rhaegar, the head of the Alchemists Guild, who had produced such vast quantities of wildfire for the king. Now, what happened next is debated heavily to this day, and the exact circumstances of how Jaime Lannister became the Kingslayer are only known to the man himself. Some say that Sir Jaime was more loyal to his father than his king, and thus struck down Aerys. But there is another version of this story, one only very few know or speak of. It is said that a messenger informed Sir Jaime of Wisdom Rhaegar's meeting with the king, and that he had just that moment left the throne room. Given the current situation, Jaime knew what this would mean, that Aerys did intend to burn King's Landing with wildfire. Witnesses at least have stated that Sir Jaime found Rhaegar at the postern gate of the keep, killing him before he could leave the castle and give the order for the wildfire to be lit. With Rhaegar's death, the execution of the Wildfire Plot had temporarily been halted. Sir Jaime next went to the throne room of the Red Keep, where the Mad King was waiting, where he informed him that he killed Rhaegar. In shock, it is believed Aerys attempted to flee onto his throne, but Sir Jaime hauled Aerys off the steps and slashed his throat, killing the Mad King before he could find another to send a message to the pyromancers. While this version of events is the lesser known tale of Aerys' death and Sir Jaime Lannister's role in it, it should not wholly be discounted. Did Sir Jaime kill his king? Yes. Are his motivations unknowable? Yes. But in both versions of events, one thing is clear. Aerys was dead, and the wildfire was not lit due to the actions of Jaime Lannister, whatever they may have truly been. What happened in the direct aftermath of Aerys' death, with much more certainty, as just in time to witness Aerys' death, several knights from the Westerlands, including Sir Ellis Westerling and Lord Roland Cratecool, burst into the hall. One thing was clear to all. Sir Jaime Lannister had killed King Aerys, and with that, Jaime Lannister became forever known as the Kingslayer. Jaime ordered his father's men to spread the news that Aerys was dead. Roland asked Jaime if they should proclaim a new king. It is said for a moment Jaime hesitated and considered Prince Viserys Targaryen, who had technically been Aerys' new heir after the death of Rhaegar, especially if Rhaegar had indeed been disinherited as Aerys had intended. In that moment, Sir Jaime Lannister perhaps changed the outcome of Robert's rebellion, realising both Prince Viserys and Prince Aegon descended from Aerys. He told Roland to proclaim whoever he liked. Climbing the steps of the Iron Throne, Jaime sat himself down with his sword across his knees to await who would come to claim the throne he had sworn to protect. Meanwhile, Lannister soldiers were fighting the remaining loyalists on the serpentine steps of the Red Keep and in the castle's armoury, but the day in truth had been won by the rebels. When Lord Eddard Stark did finally arrive at King's Landing from the Trident, he found the city gates open to him as he led his army of Northmen through the King's Gate. He rode up through the city to the Red Keep and into the very throne room his father and brother had been murdered in at the orders of the Mad King. Eddard entered the throne room and without saying a word stared at Jaime Lannister until the latter got up from the Iron Throne. Jaime told Lord Stark he'd been keeping the throne warm for Robert. King's Landing had been sacked, the Red Keep fallen, the Mad King dead. The rebellion was all but won, and House Targaryen destroyed. But even at war's end, there will be horrors that would leave a shadow over the realm for decades to come. Last night, he dreamt of Rhaegar's children. Lord Tywin had laid their bodies beneath the Iron Throne, wrapped in the crimson cloak of his house guard. That was clever of him. The blood did not show so badly against the red cloth. The little princess had been barefoot, still dressed in her bedgown. And the boy, the thoughts of Eddard Stark. A Game of Thrones, Chapter 45, Eddard 12. King Aerys II Targaryen was dead, killed by Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard to prevent the use of wildfire to burn King's Landing. Prince Rhaegar was dead at the Trident, leaving only 3 claimants to the Iron Throne, the children of Prince Rhaegar, Rhaenys, Aegon, both young children, and King Aerys' second son, Prince Viserys, not much older. It's not clear exactly when this rebellion became Robert's. While yes, Robert Baratheon's grandmother was a Targaryen, his grandfather, King Aegon V, by rights of conquest, any of the rebel lords could have made a claim for the Iron Throne. None did. Instead, the young Lord of Storm's End was risen up as king. He had proven himself a leader in the rebellion, and did have more than a drop of Targaryen blood of his own, which in the eyes of many gave him a stronger claim to the throne than most. Given only 4 Targaryens lived at this time, 3 of them descendants of the Mad King himself, by passing over these children, Robert Baratheon was indeed next in line to the throne. More importantly, he was a person all the rebel leaders could agree to support and a uniting figure. But while the war was won and House Targaryen fallen, even a dying dragon can fight back, and in the name of peace, horrors can be committed. As Eddard Stark was leading his northern army through the city walls below, and the Red Keep brought under the control of the rebels, 2 men scaled the walls of Maegor's Holdfast to deal with the remaining members of the royal family in King's Landing, Princess Elia Martell and her children. One of these men, Gregor Clegane, even then was feared and known as Tywin Lannister's mad attack dog. He was well known for his size, cruelty, and prowess in battle, and well over 7 feet tall. Closer to 8. He had massive shoulders and arms as thick as trunks of small trees, and a voice like stone breaking. He weighed nearly 30 stone, nearly all of it muscle, making him near inhumanly strong, a brutal man with a brutal nature. The second of these men was Sir Armory Lorch. He was a stout man with a piggy face, little eyes, and a high, thin voice. Like Gregor, the knight is regarded as cruel and unintelligent, a brutal man, the sort of man to order the deaths of non-combatants as it bored him. Importantly, both these men were sworn to Tywin Lannister and were acting under the Lord of Casterly Rock's direct instruction for the most part, to ensure that it was known that House Lannister had forsaken any ties and loyalties they once held for House Targaryen, while their involvement in the following events is widely known to have been perpetrated by Gregor and Armory. In the official histories of the rebellion, written after the war, their roles and events were not officially recorded. I grant you, it was done too brutally. Elia need not have been harmed at all. That was sheer folly. Tywin Lannister to his son Tyrion Lannister. A Storm of Swords chapter 55, Tyrion 6. Princess Rhaenys Targaryen was only 3 years old and was found hiding under her father's bed, a floor above the nursery where her mother and brother were located. She was discovered by Armory Lorch and dragged out from under the bed by her feet. Lorch then proceeded to stab the little girl an estimated 50 times with his sword. Gregor Clegane found Princess Elia Martell in her bedchamber, her infant son Aegon still in her arms. He pulled the babe from his mother and without hesitation repeatedly dashed his head against the wall till all that was left was a bloody pulp. While the following series of events is unclear, Gregor is then believed to have raped Elia Martell and savagely killed her, all while Prince Aegon's blood was covering his hands. In the direct aftermath of the events, there were some rumours, especially among the small folk, that say that King Aerys II had commanded the death of Elia and her children when he learned that Lord Tywin Lannister had taken up Lord Robert Baratheon's cause, while others suggest that Elia took her own life for fear of what would happen to her and her children in the hands of her dead husband's enemies. It's only been in the years since the rebellion the true tale has become widely known, even if it is not documented that way in history. Tywin Lannister himself claims to have been shocked at the brutality of the deaths of Elia and her children. In Rhaenys' case, he believed Lorch, who tried to justify his savagery by claiming the little girl kicked him and would not stop screaming, could simply have offered a few sweet words to calm her and a pillow to suffocate her. Regardless of Tywin's intent, the killings would always be remembered for their brutality. Furthermore, Tywin believed the death of Elia's children had been necessary to prove the loyalty of House Lannister to the rebel cause after his previous neutrality, so he did indeed directly order them killed. He would later go on to claim, however, that he had never ordered the murder of Elia, and that Elia, by herself without her children, had been nothing of consequence, stating that her death had been unnecessary. He would claim he most likely neglected to mention Elia when giving orders to Gregor, who killed her because he had not explicitly been told by Tywin to spare her. Elia's younger brother, Prince Oberyn Martell, however, believed intently that Tywin had Elia and her children killed as revenge for the slight he suffered when King Aerys II refused the marriage of his son and heir, Rhaegar, to his daughter Cersei. Aerys married Elia, whom Tywin had refused for his own heir, to Rhaegar instead. Kevan Lannister had been here, in this very hall, when Tywin laid the bodies of Prince Rhaegar's children at the foot of the Iron Throne, wrapped up in a crimson cloak. The girl had been recognisably the Princess Rhaenys, but the boy, a faceless horror of bone, brains and gore, and a few hacks of fair hair. None of us looked long. Tywin said that it was Prince Aegon, and we took him at his word. The Thoughts of Kevan Lannister, A Dance with Dragons, Epilogue. When Robert Baratheon arrived in King's Landing and took the Iron Throne for the first time, he was presented with the bodies of Elia, Rhaenys and Aegon by Lord Tywin, wrapped in a crimson Lannister cloak to better hide the blood and brutality of the murders. The deaths of Rhaenys, Aegon and Elia were met with a mixed response across the Seven Kingdoms. It is said that Robert Baratheon himself was relieved that Rhaegar's children were dead, and that he himself did not have to be the one to order it. It made his claim to the throne much more secure. Upon the protest of his friend, Eddard Stark, that the two children had been no more than babes, Robert named Rhaenys and her brother Aegon Dragonspawn. Eddard called the act murder, and after quarrelling with Robert, rode out from King's Landing in a cold rage, heading south to fight the last battles of the war on his own. It has also been stated by Sir Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard that he had not personally seen the corpses, but he had been haunted by the bloody bodies of Rhaenys and Aegon, and his own failure. Thoros of Myr, who did in fact see the bodies, believed that House Clegane was built upon dead children, and their arms should display two bloody infants instead of savage dogs. House Martell was enraged by the murder of Elia and her children. Oberyn Martell wanted to continue the war and champion the cause of Prince Viserys Targaryen, the only surviving son of King Aerys. Secret messages were sent, but the new hand of the king, Lord Jon Arryn, travelled to Sunspear, where he had returned the body of Prince Lewin Martell and spoke with Doran Martell, the Prince of Dorne, ending all talks of war. Relations between Dorne and the Iron Throne were at their lowest since they had joined the Seven Kingdoms. Sadly for Princess Elia Martell and her children, as long as they lived, they would have been a banner for the supporters of House Targaryen and the enemies of Robert to rally to. Their deaths were all but inevitable, but what was surely not was the sheer brutality of the acts committed by Gregor Clegane, an armoury lord that day. Acts so horrifying they would leave a stain on the reign of Robert Baratheon and the reputation of Tywin Lannister forever. I held Storm's End for him, watched good men starve, while Mace Tyrell and Paxter Redwine feasted within sight of my walls. Did Robert thank me? No. Stannis Baratheon to Maester Crescent. A Clash of Kings. Prologue. While in real terms, Robert's rebellion technically ended with the death of King Aerys II and the sack of King's Landing, there were still battles to be fought to secure the rebels' position. While most of the leaders of the rebellion remained in King's Landing, with the new King Robert to organise and plan how to proceed under this new dynasty, it was left to the young Lord of Winterfell, Eddard Stark, to ride south to the Stormlands and beyond, to mop up the last few remaining loyalist forces, with the biggest threat still being the Reachmen under the command of Lord Mace Tyrell, who had the king's younger brother Stannis besieged at Storm's End. It does seem that Eddard volunteered himself for this role shortly after disagreeing with his friend King Robert in regards to the fate of the children of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, with the Lord of Winterfell reported to have left King's Landing with his Northmen in a cold rage. There was not ever a suggestion that Eddard would turn cloak after his disagreement with Robert, as even at this young age, and as seen through his actions during the rebellion, Eddard Stark was a loyal and honourable man. In fact, it may have been that very honour that caused this rift between Eddard and Robert. Stannis Baratheon, King Robert's younger brother, had a vital role during the rebellion, though at first glance it would not seem so, as he had been besieged inside the Baratheon seat of Storm's End, a near impregnable fortress, for the better part of a year, by the forces of the Reach under the command of Lord Mace Tyrell. In keeping the Reachmen occupied with the siege, it prevented Mace from marching north to join his strength to the larger host of Prince Rhaegar, being rallied in the Crownlands. It is possible that with the extra numbers provided by Lord Tyrell, it may have changed the outcome of the Battle of the Trident in the favour of Rhaegar, but, as any who have studied the histories will tell you, sheer manpower is not the only element that dictates a battle. Regardless, the role Stannis had played was vital, even if no songs were written of his valour. Following Robert's defeat by Lord Randall Tarly at the Battle of Ashford, which resulted in Robert being driven away from his base of power in the Stormlands, forcing him to march north to the Riverlands, the Tyrell host defeated any remaining resistance in the Stormlands, and then marched directly on Storm's End itself. A key factor as to why this siege was so brutal is the castle's granaries and storehouses were only half full, as the war had been unexpected. Very soon after Lord Mace Tyrell had begun to besiege Storm's End, with the Reach's host, Lord Paxter Redwine, Lord of the Arbor, arrived with the Redwine fleet and closed Shipbreaker Bay to all trade and other ships, essentially cutting Storm's End off. The castle was now surrounded on all sides from both land and sea. The only way Stannis could see victory is if the siege was broken by Robert's allies. Sallying forth and taking the battle to Lord Tyrell would certainly mean death, given Stannis only had just enough men to hold the castle and not to fight a pitched battle. It is likely Stannis, being the known commander he is now, was aware of this factor and saw the benefit to Robert of him and his men occupying the Reach's forces for as long as they can, rather than committing to a heroic last stand and death, wasting their lives. Maester Crescent told Stannis that we might be forced to eat our dead, and there was no gain in flinging away good meat. Thanks to the Onion Knight, we were never reduced to dining on corpses, but it was a close thing. Renly Baratheon to Mathis Rowan. A Clash of Kings Chapter 33, Catelyn 4. Sieges, in many ways, are just as brutal as battles, but not for the reasons you imagine. To win a siege, to survive the harsh conditions, not just the commander, but his men need a certain mental fortitude and strength. The attackers also need to possess a certain level of patience. In theory, all an attacker has to do is to wait for surrender or until the defenders are weakened. If they attack too soon, even a small number of defenders could deal large losses to an attacker. In the case of the siege of Storm's End, Stannis Baratheon possessed the mental strength needed, and Mace Tyrell the patience to wait. It would be a long, drawn-out siege. The siege itself continued for the better part of a year, which is considered a very long time for a castle to be under siege. Food ran out. Despite harsh rationing, inevitably it was only a matter of time, with his garrison having to eat their horses. There are some rumours and tales that even suggest they had to eat dogs and cats, and were nearly on the brink of eating their own dead. Donal Noy, the famed blacksmith of Storm's End, who had forged Robert Baratheon's famed warhammer, lost an arm during the siege after an axe wound festered when Lord Tyrell's men probed the castle's defences. Conversely, Mace Tyrell and his bannermen, such as Pax the Redwine and Lord Mathis Rowan, feasted openly in the sights of the walls of the castle, next to the huge, lavish pavilions. Some of Mace's strength did march north to join the army of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, but most remained at Storm's End, with Mace seemingly having very little urgency to assault the castle or join with the larger royal army. For the most part, Stannis Baratheon's men respected their commander, but as time wore on, discipline did begin to fray. There was at least one incident where the castle's master-at-arms, Sir Gawain Wild, and 3 knights were caught trying to sneak out of the postern gate to surrender to the Reachmen. Stannis Baratheon prepared to have them hurled at the Tyrell host via catapult, but Maester Crescent convinced Stannis to imprison the men instead, since the garrison might need to eat the dead if their food ran out. Gawain eventually died in his cell during the siege. The siege was briefly broken in the most unexpected way. Davos Seaworth, a low-born, notorious smuggler, managed to slip through the Red Wine Fleet's lines one dark night and entered a secluded tunnel beneath Storm's End that ran deep into the castle. His ship was loaded with nothing but onions and saltfish, but for the starving garrison within the castle, it was the best food they had eaten in weeks. This food Davos had smuggled into Storm's End allowed the garrison to survive long enough for Robert Baratheon to defeat Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident and take King's Landing. As soon as the capital was secure, Lord Eddard Stark marched south on his mission to mop up any remaining loyalist resistance, with the first stop being the breaking of the Tyrell siege of Storm's End, with King Aerys II dead and the surviving Targaryens fled to Dragonstone. Mace dipped his banners as soon as Eddard and the rebels appeared on the field outside Storm's End. Within Storm's End, the horses had long since been eaten, the dogs and the cats were gone, and the garrison was down to roots and rats. Then came a night where the moon was new, and black clouds hid the stars. Cloaked in that darkness, Davos, the smuggler, had dared the red wine cordon and the rocks of Shipbreaker Bay alike. His little ship had a black hull, black sails, black oars, and a hull crammed with onions and saltfish. Little enough, yet it kept the garrison alive long enough for Eddard Stark to reach the Stormlands and break the siege. The Thoughts of Maester Crescent, A Clash of Kings, Prologue. According to some sources, the successful defence of Storm's End prevented Stannis and Renly Baratheon from falling into loyalist hands, and it helped the rebel Stormlords remain loyal to their liege lord, Robert. If Robert had lost control of his own seat, many would have questioned his ability to be king. After Lord Maester Rhael surrendered, Stannis was ordered by Robert to construct a new royal fleet immediately and assault Dragonstone, where the last of the Targaryens hid, which would take up most of Stannis' attention for the coming weeks. The majority of the Reach Lords and Knights were later pardoned by Robert for their part in the war, alongside a score of other loyalist lords and houses. As a reward for his skillful and brave actions, slipping past the Red Wine Fleet, Stannis granted Davos Seaworth a knighthood, as well as a keep and lands on Cape Wrath, a war galley to be commanded by himself, and later 2 more commanded by his 2 eldest sons. Stannis personally removed the first joints of each finger of Davos Seaworth's left hand, as punishment for his smuggling past. Having lost an arm, the blacksmith, Donal Loy, would leave Storm's End to join the Night's Watch. And now it begins. No, now it ends. Arthur Dayne in the Dreams of Eddard Stark, A Game of Thrones, Chapter 39, Eddard 10. One of the key triggers for Robert's rebellion, and thus the downfall of House Targaryen, was the moment Prince Rhaegar kidnapped Lyanna Stark near Harrenhal. There are many different rumours as to why Rhaegar chose this path. Some say he'd fallen madly in love with Lyanna at the tourney of Harrenhal, or some also argue the young Stark girl had too fallen for the prince and went willingly with Rhaegar, rather than being kidnapped. Within the context of history, we can never know the truth of the matter, but what is important is the outcome. Rhaegar disappeared with Lyanna Stark and started a bloody civil war. For most of the rebellion, Prince Rhaegar was nowhere to be seen. He fought no battles and communicated no plans, leaving his father, King Aerys II, scrambling to find his son. Rhaegar was eventually found by Sir Gerald Hightower, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, at a place known as the Tower of Joy, with Lyanna Stark and 2 more Kingsguard knights, the legendary Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, and Sir Oswell Went. Rhaegar did leave the tower and returned to King's Landing to lead his father's army at the Battle of the Trident, and to his death at the hands of Robert Baratheon. One curious element to this is Rhaegar returned alone. Lyanna was left at the tower, but even more puzzling, Dayne and Went, as well as the Lord Commander, Gerald Hightower, remained at the Tower of Joy with Lyanna, which has always been a puzzling mystery, given the Kingsguard would have proven useful at the Trident, especially when their sole purpose is to guard and protect the royal family. Thus, perhaps Rhaegar gave them a direct order to remain with Lyanna. As to why they agreed to, we shall never know. It is said that Rhaegar had named the place the Tower of Joy, but for Ned, it was a bitter memory. The Thoughts of Eddard Stark, Game of Thrones Chapter 39, Eddard 10. The location of Rhaegar's hiding place is puzzling as well. The Tower of Joy was nothing but a basic round tower in the northern edge of the Red Mountains of Dorne, located at the north end of the Prince's Pass, with Kingsgrave to the south and Night Song to the north. While Rhaegar was married to Elia Martell, the Prince of Dorne's sister, it was assumed that Rhaegar had angered the Dornish greatly when he abandoned his wife and children and kidnapped the Stark girl. Many saw this action as a deep insult towards his wife and thus Dorne, Elia and his children. Yet Rhaegar chose to hide away for months in Dorne itself. Some suggest this hiding place may have been Arthur Dayne's idea, given the Kingsguard Knight was Dornish and from the relatively close castle of Starfall to the south. The tower was basic and isolated, and how Gerald Hightower found its location is lost to history, for reasons that will soon become very clear. After lifting the siege at Storm's End, Lord Eddard Stark rode further south with 6 companions: Howland Reed, Lord Willem Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Cassell, Theo Wool, and Sir Mark Risewell, leaving the Stark army at Storm's End. Why Eddard took such a small number to look for his sister has often been explained by his desire to move quickly, something you cannot do with a large army. When the rebels took King's Landing, there were some who assumed that Lyanna Stark may have been located there, given Prince Rhaegar had returned from hiding. But evidently, she was not, and is perhaps another reason why Eddard Stark was more than happy to be charged with lifting of the Tyrell siege at Storm's End, giving him ample opportunity to look for his sister. Again, how Eddard found the tower and knew where to even start looking is again another element surrounding these events that we will never know the answer to. Eddard Stark and his band of followers did travel to the Red Mountains of Dawn and find the location of this Tower of Joy, and thus Lyanna Stark, but it was sadly too late. The exact true series of events that happened at the Tower of Joy is not known to us, given out of the 11 people there, only 2 would walk away with their lives. But the little we do know seems to indicate the following: that as Eddard Stark and his band approached the tower to recover Eddard's sister, they found it protected by Gerald, Arthur and Oswell of the Kingsguard. A short and bloody fight ensued, the 7 Northmen versus the 3 Kingsguard. We do not know the details of this apparent legendary battle, but all we can say for a fact is only Eddard Stark and Howland Reed were left standing. Eddard did find his sister in the tower, but they were too late. Lyanna Stark was dead, or at the very least dying. The circumstances of her death and what caused it are unknown to us, but like many of the events surrounding the Tower of Joy, it's filled with suspicion and mystery that not all is as it seems. We do have one clue that could give us some details regarding the fate of Lyanna. Before leaving the tower behind, Eddard and Howland pulled stones from it to make 8 urns for the 8 men who had died fighting that day. Even though Eddard is known as a man of honour, it would be a strange choice for him to have given his foe in Dane, Went and Hightower proper burials and treated with respect and honour if the Kingsguard Knights had personally been responsible for the death of Lyanna, which indicates to us she had not been killed by an act of foul play. The finest knight I ever saw was Sir Arthur Dane, who fought with a blade called Dawn, forged from the heart of a fallen star. They called him the Sword of the Morning, and he would have killed me but for Howland Reed, Eddard Stark to Bran Stark. Rather than make the obvious choice of now returning home to Winterfell with his sister's body, Eddard Stark made one more unexpected move. He looked south and not north, with the 2 survivors of the Tower of Joy travelling to the seat of House Dane, Starfall. It seems ever the honourable man, Eddard Stark travelled all that way to return the legendary ancestral sword of House Dane and inform the Danes of Sir Arthur's death. Some have also rightly pointed out the possibility that Eddard also travelled to Starfall to not only return the blade, but perhaps visit his once rumoured lover, Ashara Dane. While the relationship between the two had always been that, rumours, it does add a layer of complexity to her eventual fate. Sometime after Eddard had left Starfall, Ashara Dane threw herself from the tallest towers of Starfall into the sunset sea below. Several reasons have been cited as to why Ashara chose to commit suicide. A broken heart, because of her stillborn daughter, because of a stolen child, for the man who had dishonoured her at Harrenhal, or due to the grief over her brother's death. Her body was never found. At Winterfell, over the next few years, rumours would spread among the soldiers of Eddard Stark of the tale that Ashara Dane was in fact Eddard's bastard son Jon Snow's mother. When Eddard's wife, Lady Catelyn, heard these stories from her maid, it is reported she did confront Eddard, who refused to confirm or deny anything regarding the matter, and subsequently silenced all talk of Ashara at Winterfell. Her name was never mentioned at the castle again. Some scholars of history have suggested this information points towards Eddard being the man who apparently dishonoured Ashara at Harrenhal with her stolen child, really being Jon Snow. However, there is very little proof other than speculation regarding these tales, and like so much surrounding the Tower of Joy, they will forever remain a mystery. It is likely the boy's mother is another woman altogether. While Eddard had been upset with King Robert Baratheon after the sack of King's Landing, the death of his sister Lyanna Stark, who Robert deeply loved, reconciled the old friends. Eddard returned Lyanna's remains to the north, so she could be buried beside her brother Brandon and her father Lord Rickard. While traditionally only lords or kings are honoured with statues in the crypts of Winterfell, Ned commissioned statues for both his brother and his sister as exceptions. I built a fleet at Robert's command, took Dragonstone in his name. Did he make me hand and say, "Well done, brother? Whatever should I do without you?" No, he blamed me for letting Willem Darry steal away Viserys and the babe, as if I could have stopped it. Stannis Baratheon to Crescent, A Clash of Kings, Prologue. While Robert's rebellion was effectively won with the death of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen in the waters of the Trident, it was not the last conflict of the war. Even after the death of the Mad King, news takes time to travel, and some, despite all odds, are even still willing to carry on the fight. Such was the case with the two battles that occurred after the Trident. One of these battles was directly commanded by King Robert, the other very much done on his behalf. Quillian Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, desired neutrality for the Iron Men during the Civil War, something which the Ironborn had typically done in other civil wars, letting the Iron Throne solve its own problems. In fact, many Greyjoy lords would use the backdrop of war as an excuse to raid up and down the western coasts. Such was the case with Dalton Greyjoy during the latter part of the Dance of the Dragons. After news reached Pike about the death of the Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident, Lord Quillian was convinced by his eldest sons, Balon, Euron and Victarion, to join the rebels as soon as possible, or else lose all chance at spoils, with some even then possibly questioning the loyalty of House Greyjoy to the new ruling house of the Seven Kingdoms. Quillian personally led 50 longships in attacking the Reach, whom were for the most part royalist supporters. Since the intentions at this time of House Lannister of Casterly Rock were as of yet unknown, most of the Iron Fleet remained at home to guard against the Westerlands in case a retaliatory attack from Lord Tywin, despite the fact the war was all but won for the rebels at this stage. The Greyjoys raided the coast of the Reach, sinking or capturing some ships and raiding some villages and towns. They were unexpectedly met at the mouth of the River Manda by longships of the Shield Islands. 12 of these ships were sunk or captured during the battle, with the Greyjoys emerging victorious. But the aged Lord Quillian was slain during the fighting, however. Although the Iron Men won the battle, Quillian's eldest son and heir, Balon Greyjoy, decided to return to Pike to claim the Seastone Chair of the Iron Islands, and with that, the Ironborn contribution to Robert's rebellion was done, and was minimal, as they would not take part in any of the other conflicts for the rest of the rebellion. Arguably the most important of these latter battles came after the death of King Aerys II, and after Eddard Stark had broken the siege of Storm's End. The assault on Dragonstone, the historical seat of House Targaryen in the middle of Blackwater Bay, the very same island Aegon the Conqueror had launched his invasion of the Seven Kingdoms from all those centuries ago. In the last days of his life, King Aerys II Targaryen had impregnated his wife, Queen Rhaella Targaryen. While Aerys, now very rarely laid with his wife, he became enamoured after burning his hand to the king, Lord Carlton Chesteld, for opposing his wildfire scheme. After the Mad King learned that the Crown Prince had died at the hands of Robert Baratheon in the Battle of the Trident, he sent Rhaella with Prince Viserys Targaryen, his second son, and argued heir, to Dragonstone, the ancient island stronghold of House Targaryen. Rhaella and Viserys travelled from the Red Keep on Aegon's High Hill to a ship waiting in the port below in the early hours of the morning, trying to remain incognito and to keep knowledge of their escape as limited as possible. But in truth, after the fall of King's Landing to the rebels, it became clear knowledge of their escape was common to the lords still at court, willing to work with the rebels. It is most likely that Sir Jaime Lannister, whom had been privy to this knowledge, informed his father, Lord Tywin, It also has been put forward that some of the surviving members of King Aerys' small council, specifically Lord Varys the Spider, may have traded the information for a pardon. We do not know the truth of the matter. The important part of this story is the rebels learned the location of the last remaining members of the royal family. As soon as the siege of Storm's End was broken by Eddard Stark, King Robert tasked his younger brother, Stannis Baratheon, with building a new fleet for House Baratheon as quick as possible and to take the island of Dragonstone. While the island only hosted a small army, it was highly defensible and in theory would not be an easy task to capture. Rhaegar Targaryen spent the duration of her pregnancy on Dragonstone, while Stannis was stuck on the mainland, building the new royal fleet in the waters of Blackwater Bay, readying himself for the Dragonstone assault on the Targaryen stronghold. 9 months after sailing from King's Landing, Rhaegar gave birth to her only living daughter, whom she named Daenerys, while a raging summer storm threatened to rip the island's fastness apart. Princess Daenerys would often be called Daenerys Stormborn throughout her childhood as a result. Sadly, Rhaegar Targaryen, a woman who had suffered many stillbirths and miscarriages, died shortly after her daughter was born from complications of childbirth. While it did take Stannis Baratheon months to prepare for the assault on Dragonstone, in the end it would be a swift affair and fairly straightforward. The truth is, while the Loyalists could buy time, Stannis Baratheon had all the time in the world to wait, and there was no hope of victory for the handful of men still loyal to House Targaryen, and these men were all too aware of that fact. Commanding from the decks of a huge new war galley called Fury, Stannis set sail with the new royal fleet to capture the island. As soon as the Baratheon banner was in sight, the garrison of the castle sent word to Stannis they were ready to sell Prince Viserys, now Aerys' undisputed heir, and the infant Daenerys to the Baratheons. However, just before Stannis came ashore, Sir Willem Darry, the former Master-at-Arms of the Red Keep, led 4 other loyalists in smuggling Prince Viserys and Princess Daenerys, as well as a wet nurse from Dragonstone, under the cover of night. They sailed for the Braavosian coastline across the Narrow Sea. The smaller, faster ship would outpace the huge war galleys of House Baratheon, and once across the Narrow Sea, finding Viserys and Daenerys would be no easy task. Ultimately, Stannis' assault on Dragonstone was successful, and he conquered the island and its castle in the name of King Robert Baratheon. With the conquest of Dragonstone, the Targaryens lost their last holdings in the Seven Kingdoms. Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen, the last of the House of the Dragon, who had ruled the Seven Kingdoms for 285 years, were left with nothing, apart from the little that could be carried out of Dragonstone with them. They lived in exile with Sir Willem Darry in Braavos until Darry's death, then being constantly on the move up and down the western coast of Essos, being hosted by one patron after another. Prince Viserys in time would come to be known as the Beggar King. King Robert Baratheon granted Dragonstone to Stannis, making him Lord of Dragonstone. The island castle was traditionally the seat of the Crown Prince, the Prince of Dragonstone. Sir Robert honoured Stannis by granting him the seat of the heir to the Iron Throne, which at this time Stannis was. However, Robert was also furious that the Targaryen children had escaped before Stannis arrived, and he granted the ancestral seat of House Baratheon, Storm's End, to his youngest brother, Renly, which Stannis resented as an intentional slight. Even when children were born to Robert, Stannis would keep the title of Prince of Dragonstone, forming a new house in House Baratheon of Dragonstone, becoming one of the 3 branches of House Baratheon in the wake of Robert becoming king. Renly Baratheon became head of House Baratheon of Storm's End, with Robert forming the new house of House Baratheon of King's Landing. Robert Baratheon would still be the head of the house and hold authority over the other branches.